He gave his daughter the last of the good food from his lunchbox. A quiet sacrifice he thought no one saw but across the park. A woman sat on a bench watching the whole thing. A woman who owned the very skyscraper that cast a shadow over them, and who was about to realize that the one thing she couldn't buy was the one thing this man had in spades. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The afternoon sun was a pale, watery gold, the kind that offered light but no warmth, filtering through the skeletal branches of the city park's oak trees. Liam sat on the edge of a worn wooden bench, the splintered green paint cold against the back of his legs. His work boots, caked in a familiar mix of sawdust and dried mud, were planted firmly on the cracked pavement, a silent testament to a long morning spent wrestling with a warped doorframe on the 10th floor of a building he'd never be able to afford to live in. Beside him, his daughter Maya swung her legs back and forth, the heels of her scuffed pink sneakers thumping a cheerful, rhythmic beat against the bench's support. She was 7. A whirlwind of bright, curious energy wrapped in a slightly too big denim jacket he'd found at a thrift store last fall. Her hair, the same shade of dark honey as her mother's had been, was pulled into a messy ponytail that had already started to escape its confines. "Is it lunchtime yet, Daddy?" she asked, her voice a hopeful melody that cut through the city's dull roar. Liam forced a smile, the gesture feeling heavier than the toolbox he'd just hauled down 10 flights of stairs. "Almost, sweet pea. Just catching our breath." He reached for the old metal lunchbox at his feet, its surface dented and scratched from years of being tossed into the back of his truck. The latch squeaked in protest as he opened it. Inside, the contents were meager, a carefully curated selection of what little was left in their refrigerator. There was an apple, shiny and red, a small bag of baby carrots, a juice box, and 2 sandwiches. One was made with thick slices of turkey and cheese on whole wheat bread, the kind Maya loved. The other was just 2 heels of that same loaf of bread with a thin smear of peanut butter, a pathetic excuse for a meal he'd cobbled together for himself. He knew Maya would have offered him half of hers without a second thought, her generosity as boundless as her energy. But he couldn't let her. It was his job to make sure she had enough, even if it meant he didn't. He handed her the good sandwich, the apple, and the juice box, his movements slow and deliberate. "Here you go, Munchkin. All the good stuff for the birthday girl's warm-up." Her birthday was tomorrow, a fact that sat like a stone in his stomach. He had $43 to his name, and most of that was already earmarked for the gas he needed to get to a potential job on the other side of town. "What are you having?" she asked, already unwrapping her sandwich with the surgical precision of a child who took her food very seriously. Liam held up his own sad-looking creation. "Specialty of the house," he said with a wink, trying to inject a lightness into his voice that he didn't feel. "The chef's surprise." Maya giggled, a sound that was worth more than any meal, and took a big bite. Across the wide expanse of browning grass, hidden in the cool shadow of a polished granite monument, Catherine Thorne watched them. She sat alone, a cashmere scarf wrapped around her neck, her leather tote bag resting beside her like a well-behaved dog. Her phone buzzed with notifications, missed calls from her board, emails from her legal team, alerts from a stock market that bent to her will, but she ignored them all. She had come to the park seeking a moment of silence, a brief respite from the clatter of her life, a life built on acquisitions, mergers, and the cold, hard logic of profit and loss. She hadn't expected to find a story unfolding on a bench 50 yards away. She watched the man give the little girl the better sandwich. She saw the quiet resignation in his shoulders, the carefully constructed smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. It was a small moment, insignificant to the world, a detail that would be swallowed by the city's relentless pace. But to Catherine, it was everything. It was a currency of love she hadn't dealt in for years. She saw the way his worn jacket didn't quite keep out the chill, the way he rubbed his calloused hands together for warmth while his daughter ate. He was a man holding the world together with frayed rope and quiet dignity, and something in her, something she thought had long since turned to stone, began to ache with a strange, unfamiliar pang of recognition. He thought no one was watching, but she was. And in the silent, sterile world she inhabited, a world of glass towers and empty applause, this quiet act of selfless love felt more real and more valuable than anything she owned. The little girl, Maya, finished her sandwich with a satisfied hum, carefully wiping her mouth with the back of her hand before folding the wax paper into a neat, tiny square. Liam watched her, his own pathetic peanut butter sandwich sitting untouched on his lap. The gnawing hunger in his gut was a familiar companion, a dull ache he had learned to ignore, but the ache in his chest was sharper, more insistent. Seeing her happy, seeing her fed, was a victory, but it was a victory that always came with the bitter tang of his own inadequacy. He couldn't give her the world. Hell, most days he could barely give her a full meal without it costing him something essential. He took a slow breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and finally picked up his sandwich. He was about to take a bite, to perform the act of eating for her benefit, when Maya looked up at him, her brow furrowed with the serious, analytical gaze she inherited from her mother. "You don't like it, do you?" she asked, her voice soft. Liam froze, the sandwich halfway to his mouth. "What? Of course I do, sweet pea. It's rustic." She shook her head, her ponytail flopping from side to side. "No, your eyes look sad when you look at it. You can have the rest of my apple." She held it out, her small hand steady, offering him the better part of her own meal. His heart clenched. It was a simple gesture, but it was a mirror of his own, a perfect, unprompted reflection of the love he was trying so desperately to give her. "I'm okay, Munchkin," he said, his voice thick. "You eat it. You need the energy for all the important 7-year-old stuff you've got to do." He managed to smile, and this time it felt a little more real. From her vantage point, Catherine saw the exchange, and it was the second act of the play that broke through the last of her carefully constructed composure. The father's sacrifice was one thing. It was a parent's duty. But the child's response, that innate, untaught empathy, was another. It was a closed loop of pure, unconditional love, a perfect system operating on a worn park bench in the middle of a cold afternoon. She felt a sudden, sharp impulse to do something, anything. It was a foreign feeling. Her solutions were usually structured, delegated, executed with ruthless efficiency. She solved problems with money, with power, with influence. But this wasn't a problem to be solved. This was something sacred, something she felt an almost desperate need not to spoil, but to honor. She looked down at the untouched picnic basket her assistant had packed for her, filled with artisanal cheeses, prosciutto-wrapped figs, and a bottle of sparkling water that cost more than Liam's entire lunchbox. The absurdity of it, the sheer glaring chasm between their two worlds, hit her with the force of a physical blow. She couldn't just walk over and offer them food. That would be an act of pity, a clumsy intrusion that would shatter the dignity the man was so clearly trying to protect. No, it had to be something else. Something quiet. Something that felt like fate, not charity. She stood up, her mind, for the first time in a long time, not on spreadsheets or contracts, but on the delicate art of anonymous kindness. She began to walk, not directly toward them, but on a wide, looping path around the edge of the lawn, her expensive boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. A plan, fragile and uncertain, beginning to form in her mind. Liam watched Maya chase a rogue pigeon, her laughter echoing in the crisp air. For a few precious moments, the weight on his shoulders lifted. In her joy, he found his own brief escape. He finally took a bite of his sandwich, the dry bread sticking to the roof of his mouth, and decided it was better than nothing. He was packing away the lunchbox, carefully tucking the waxed paper and empty juice box into a side pocket to throw away later, when he noticed the woman. She was walking along the path that bordered the far side of the playground, her pace unhurried, her posture elegant even in the fading light. He'd noticed her earlier, a still, solitary figure who seemed strangely out of place in this scruffy public space. Now she was closer, her path inadvertently bringing her near their bench. She was on her phone, her voice a low, professional murmur, her attention seemingly focused on the conversation. As she passed a large, overflowing trash can, she paused, gesturing with one hand as she spoke, and with a motion so smooth it was almost imperceptible. She let the leather tote bag she'd been carrying slip from her shoulder. It landed softly on the grass beside the can, half hidden by a clump of overgrown weeds. She didn't break stride, didn't look back. She just kept walking, her voice never faltering, until she rounded a bend and disappeared from view. Liam stared at the spot where the bag lay. He waited. A minute passed, then two. No one came for it. It was a nice bag, the kind of supple, understated leather that screamed money without having to shout. He knew he should probably just leave it, mind his own business. But he also knew what it was like to lose something you couldn't afford to replace. "Stay here, Maya," he said, his voice low. He walked over to the trash can, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. He picked up the bag. It was heavier than he expected. He unzipped it just enough to look for a wallet, a name, some form of identification. Instead, his eyes met with the contents of the picnic basket from Catherine's earlier thoughts. A thermos, still warm to the touch, a container of what looked like gourmet soup, 2 thick sandwiches wrapped in parchment paper, a bag of crisp green grapes, and 2 bottles of that ridiculously expensive water. Tucked into a side pocket was a slim leather wallet. He opened it. The driver's license had a picture of the woman Catherine Thorne. The address was a penthouse on the Upper East Side, the very building he could see glinting in the distance. And behind the license, there was no cash, just a single, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, done in bright, waxy crayons, of a stick figure woman with a crown, holding hands with a smaller stick figure. At the bottom, in shaky, block letters, it read, "For Mommy, the Queen of Everything." The drawing was old, the paper softened and creased at the folds. Liam's breath caught. This wasn't just a forgotten lunch. This felt intentional. He looked from the bag to the path where she had disappeared, a strange and unsettling feeling prickling at the back of his neck. This was no accident. The quiet park no longer felt quiet. It felt charged, as if he had just stumbled into the middle of a story he didn't understand. Catherine's heart was pounding. She stood behind the thick trunk of an ancient elm tree, just out of sight, peering through the branches like a spy in her own life. She had never done anything so clumsy, so transparent, so human. Her entire career had been built on precise, calculated moves, on anticipating every outcome, on controlling the narrative. Leaving a $1,000 bag full of food by a trash can was the antithesis of everything she was. It was messy, it was risky, it was an act of pure, unadulterated hope, and it terrified her. She watched as Liam picked up the bag. She saw the caution in his posture, the way he scanned the area before touching it. He wasn't an opportunist. He was a protector, even of a stranger's property. She held her breath as he opened it, as he found the wallet, as he found the drawing. That drawing. She hadn't looked at it in years, but she kept it with her always, a talisman from a life she'd had before this one, a life with her own daughter, lost not to tragedy, but to the bitter, sterile custody battle that her ex-husband's money had won. He had argued she was an absentee mother, a CEO who loved boardrooms more than bedtime stories, and the court had agreed. Now her daughter lived across the country, a stranger being raised by a woman who served her organic snacks and scheduled her playdates with the same efficiency Catherine scheduled mergers. The drawing was all she had left of the time she was just Mommy. She watched Liam's shoulders slump slightly as he read the childish scrawl. She saw the flicker of understanding, of empathy, cross his face. He wasn't looking at it as a piece of paper. He saw the story behind it. He knew. In that moment, he knew this was more than a lost lunch. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the park, and for a terrifying second, their eyes almost met. She ducked back behind the tree, her hand pressed to her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. What was she doing? This was insane. She should just walk away, get in her chauffeured car, and return to the silent, predictable world that was waiting for her. But she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, compelled by the quiet dignity of a man who gave his daughter the good sandwich, and the unexpected kindness of a man who was now carefully zipping her bag, his expression a mixture of confusion, pity, and a deep, soul-shaking respect. He didn't shout, "Hey, you forgot your bag!" He didn't pocket the contents. He just stood there, holding a piece of her life in his hands, and waited. Liam walked back to the bench, the leather bag feeling alien and heavy in his hand. Maya looked up from her game of tracing patterns on the ground with a stick. "Whose is that?" "I think that lady dropped it," he said, his mind still reeling. The drawing, the name. The whole setup felt too orchestrated to be an accident, but too personal to be a prank. It felt like a message, but he didn't know what it was trying to say. He placed the bag carefully on the bench, a respectful distance from his own dented lunchbox. The contrast was stark, a perfect illustration of the canyon between their lives. He should call out, find her, return it. That was the right thing to do. But the soup was still warm. The sandwiches were thick with fillings he hadn't been able to afford in months. His stomach rumbled in protest at his own integrity. And then there was the drawing. A woman who carried a child's drawing in a wallet that held no cash was a woman who was carrying a story, and Liam knew better than most that some stories were too fragile to be interrupted by a stranger yelling across a park. He sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through his jeans. He could feel the warmth radiating from the thermos, a silent invitation. Maya, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding, scooted closer and peered at the bag. "Does it have food in it?" she whispered, as if the bag itself could hear her. "It does," Liam said, his voice low. "But it's not ours." "But she lost it," Maya reasoned with the simple, irrefutable logic of a 7-year-old. "And we found it. Finders keepers?" Liam managed a weak smile. "It doesn't work that way, sweet pea. Not with things that matter." He looked around the park again. It was emptying out as the afternoon faded, the shadows growing long and purple. There was no sign of the woman. She had vanished as completely as if she had been a ghost. He knew he had a choice. He could leave the bag, pretend he never saw it. He could take it to the park ranger's office, a bureaucratic black hole from which it would likely never emerge. Or he could wait. He could sit here on this cold bench, with his own hunger a dull ache in his belly, and guard this stranger's expensive, lonely, and intentionally placed lunch. He glanced at the drawing one more time in his mind's eye. For Mommy, the queen of everything. He looked at Maya, her face bright with innocent curiosity, and he knew what he had to do. He zipped the bag fully, placed it securely between them, and leaned back. He would wait, because whatever this was, it wasn't about the food. It was about something else entirely, and he felt a strange, compelling need to see it through. An hour crawled by, each minute stretching longer than the last. The sun had dipped below the city's jagged skyline, and the park lights flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the deserted paths. Maya had fallen asleep, her head resting on Liam's lap, her small body warm and heavy against him. Liam's own body was stiff with cold, his stomach a hollow, aching void. He had replayed the scene 100 times in his mind, searching for a rational explanation, but none came. The woman, Catherine Thorne, had left the bag on purpose. He was sure of it now. It was a deliberate act, a calculated offering disguised as an accident. But why? Was it pity? A misguided attempt at charity from a woman who had so much she could afford to literally throw it away? The thought made his jaw tighten. He had never taken a handout in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. He had built his life, and Maya's, on a foundation of hard work and quiet pride. They didn't have much, but what they had earned. Yet, the drawing complicated things. It wasn't an act of pity, it was an act of vulnerability. It was a shared secret, a silent acknowledgement of the universal language of parenthood and loss. The woman wasn't just a rich lady, she was a mother. A mother who was, for some reason, just as lonely as he was. Just as he was about to give up, to hoist his sleeping daughter into his arms and take the bag to the nearest police precinct, he saw her. She emerged from the shadows near the elm tree, her figure hesitant at first, then more resolved as she walked toward them. She had changed out of her professional attire and was now wearing simple jeans and a thick wool sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple, unadorned knot. She looked less like a CEO and more like a person. She stopped a few feet from the bench, her hands tucked into her pockets, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I thought you might be gone," she said, her voice soft, carrying a hint of surprise. Liam didn't stand up. He didn't want to disturb Maya. "Wasn't going to leave this," he said, nodding toward the bag. "I figured you might come back for it." Catherine looked from the bag to his face, her gaze searching. "Thank you. You didn't forget it, did you?" he asked, the question blunt, direct. There was no point in dancing around it. She met his gaze, and, to her credit, she didn't lie. "No," she whispered. "I didn't." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy. "Why?" Liam asked, his voice low, almost a growl. "We're not a charity case. I don't need your pity." "It wasn't pity," she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "It was recognition. I saw you with your daughter, and I saw something real. And I haven't been around real in a very long time." She looked at the sleeping form of Maya, her expression softening into something achingly sad. "I have a daughter, too. I don't get to see her." And there it was, the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough. Liam's anger, the protective shell of his pride, began to crack. He looked at this woman, this stranger, who had orchestrated this bizarre, silent encounter, and he didn't see a billionaire. He saw a fellow traveler in the lonely landscape of loss, a person who understood the gaping hole a child's absence could leave. He finally gestured to the other end of the bench. "The soup's probably cold by now." Catherine managed a small, watery smile, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat down. The silence that fell between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the unspoken understanding of two people who had just found a strange, unexpected kinship on a cold park bench under the dim city lights. They didn't eat the soup. The moment for that had passed, replaced by something more substantial. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the sleeping child, a warm, breathing bridge between them. Liam finally broke the stillness, his voice rough. "She lives with her dad," he said. Not as a question, but as a statement of quiet understanding. Catherine nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant, glittering lights of the city. "He has more money, more time, according to the courts. He argued that my work, my travel, it made me an unfit parent. And he won." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a flat, exhausted acceptance. "I get a phone call on Tuesdays and a visit on her birthday. It's all very scheduled." Liam thought of his own life. The constant juggle of jobs and childcare, the scraped-together meals, the worn-out clothes. By the world's standards, he was the one who was failing. But he had Maya. He got to tuck her in at night, to read her bedtime stories, to see her face light up over a simple sandwich. He was richer than this woman, in the only way that truly mattered. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "Me too," she whispered. "What about Maya's mom?" "Car accident," Liam said, the words still feeling like stones in his mouth even after 3 years. It was fast. 1 minute she was here, the next, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Catherine reached out, her hand hesitating for a moment, before resting gently on his arm. Her touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt of warmth through his cold, tired body. "You're a good father, Liam." He looked at her, surprised. "How do you know my name?" She gave a small, sheepish smile. "Your lunchbox. It has a piece of masking tape on it with Liam M. written in marker." He glanced down at the dented metal box, a relic from his own father. "Of course. And you're Catherine Thorne," he said, remembering the driver's license. The queen of everything. The words from the drawing slipped out before he could stop them. Her breath hitched, and for a second he thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just nodded, a sad, knowing look in her eyes. That's what she used to call me. They fell silent again, the city's hum, a distant lullaby. The cold was seeping deeper into his bones, but Liam didn't want to move. He didn't want this strange, fragile moment to end. He was sitting on a park bench with a billionaire who had intentionally left her expensive bag for him to find, a woman who was just as broken and lonely as he was. The world had never felt so strange or so small. Maya stirred in his lap, mumbling something in her sleep about pigeons and peanut butter. Liam gently stroked her hair, his calloused fingers catching in the fine strands. "We should probably go," he said, his voice reluctant. "It's getting late." Catherine didn't protest. She stood up, pulling her sweater tighter around herself. Can I give you a ride?" she offered, her voice uncertain. "My car is just around the corner." Liam hesitated. His truck was parked 6 blocks away, a long, cold walk with a sleeping child in his arms. But accepting a ride felt like crossing a line, like accepting a favor he couldn't repay. It felt like the beginning of a debt. "We're fine," he said, his pride kicking in automatically. "We like the walk." Catherine's face fell, just for a moment, but she masked it quickly with a polite nod. "Of course." "Well, thank you. For waiting. For understanding." "No problem," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He carefully shifted Maya into his arms, her body a warm, trusting weight against his chest. He stood up, the leather bag still in his hand. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, electric, and it made him pull his hand back faster than he intended. They stood there for a moment longer, two strangers, bound by an evening of shared vulnerability, not sure how to say goodbye. "Will I see you again?" she asked. The question so quiet, he almost didn't hear it over the sound of a distant siren. Liam looked down. At the sleeping face of his daughter, then back at the woman whose eyes held a galaxy of sadness and unspoken hope. "It's a big city," he said, which wasn't an answer at all. And then he turned and walked away, the rhythm of his footsteps steady and sure on the cold pavement, leaving her standing alone under the jaundiced glow of the park lights. The walk back to the truck felt longer than it should have. Each step was a conscious effort, the weight of Maya in his arms a familiar comfort, but the weight of the evening's events a heavy, unsettling burden. The air was cold and sharp, and the city, which usually felt like a backdrop to his life, now felt like an active participant, its glittering towers and indifferent hum a constant reminder of the world Catherine Thorne belonged to and the world he did not. He gently settled Maya into her car seat, her breath fogging the chilly air, and for a moment he just watched her sleep. Her face, so peaceful and untroubled, was his anchor, his true north. Everything he did, every sacrifice he made, was for her. It was that simple and that complicated. He finally climbed into the driver's seat, the truck's engine groaning to life with a familiar, rattling cough. As he pulled out onto the street, he glanced back toward the park, but the bench was empty. Catherine was gone. He told himself it was for the best. She was a fleeting anomaly, a brief, strange chapter in a life that had no room for complications. He had his world, she had hers, and the two were never meant to intersect. But as he drove through the sleeping city, her face kept appearing in his mind's eye, the sadness in her eyes, the vulnerability in her voice when she spoke of her daughter. The way her hand had felt on his arm, a brief, fleeting moment of human connection that had somehow managed to breach the walls he had so carefully built around his heart. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He was a carpenter. He fixed things. He worked with his hands, with tangible materials, with problems that had clear, logical solutions. He didn't know what to do with a woman who left designer bags full of gourmet food as a cry for help. He didn't know what to do with the strange, unsettling feeling that he had just walked away from something that mattered. By the time he got home to their small second-floor apartment, the feeling hadn't dissipated. It had settled deep in his chest, a dull, persistent ache. He carried Maya inside, tucked her into bed, and stood for a long time in the quiet darkness of her room, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. He was her protector. He was her everything. And he would not, could not, risk that for anyone. Not even for a lonely queen who had lost her way. He went back to the living room and sank onto the worn couch, the springs groaning in protest. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was a forgotten park bench, a sleeping child, and the sad, searching eyes of a woman he would probably never see again. The next morning, Maya's birthday, dawned with a determinedly cheerful sun, its rays slicing through the dusty windows of their small apartment. Liam was already in the kitchen, attempting to make a stack of pancakes that looked more like the lopsided, celebratory creations he saw in cartoons, and less like the sad, flat discs they usually turned out to be. He had used the last of the flour and the one remaining egg. He was trying. That's what he told himself. He was trying. Maya burst into the kitchen, her eyes bright with the uncontainable joy of a newly minted 7-year-old. "Pancakes!" she squealed, wrapping her arms around his legs. "Happy birthday, my sweet pea," he said, scooping her up and spinning her around. For a moment, watching her laugh, he forgot about the $43, the empty fridge, the encounter in the park. For a moment, everything was okay. After their lopsided breakfast, he gave her his gift. It was a small hand-carved wooden bird, a little bluebird, with wings outstretched, as if in mid-flight. He had spent weeks secretly sanding and painting it in the garage after she went to bed, using scraps of wood from a job site. It wasn't the doll she had been pointing at in store windows, but it was from him. It was made with his hands, with his love. Her reaction was more than he could have hoped for. She held it with a reverence usually reserved for fragile, ancient artifacts. "It's beautiful, Daddy," she whispered, her fingers tracing the smooth, painted feathers. "It looks like it's flying." "It is," he said, his voice thick. "It can fly anywhere it wants to go." Later that day, they were at the small community workshop where Liam sometimes picked up side jobs, a cavernous space that always smelled of sawdust and varnish. He was fixing a wobbly leg on an antique chair, his mind focused on the familiar rhythm of the work, when Maya, who had been quietly coloring at a nearby workbench, let out a small gasp. "Daddy, look!" Liam glanced over. Standing in the wide-open doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, was Catherine. She was holding a single brightly wrapped gift, a perfect cube tied with a shimmering silver ribbon. She looked hesitant, uncertain, as if she had come all this way and was only now considering the possibility that she shouldn't have. Liam put down his sandpaper, his heart giving a sudden hard thump against his ribs. He wiped his hands on his jeans, a nervous, reflexive gesture. He hadn't expected to see her again. He had convinced himself that their encounter was a one-time event, a strange, shared dream. But here she was, in his world, holding a birthday present for his daughter. Catherine took a tentative step into the workshop, her eyes adjusting to the dim, dusty light. "I hope this is okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I remembered you said it was her birthday." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Maya, who was now staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Liam didn't know what to say. Part of him, the proud, protective part, wanted to tell her they didn't need her gifts, that they were fine on their own. But another part, the part that had sat on that cold bench with her, the part that recognized the deep, aching loneliness in her eyes, couldn't turn her away. Before he could speak, Maya slid off her stool and walked slowly toward Catherine. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze shifting from Catherine's face to the gift, then back again. "Are you the picnic lady?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Catherine let out a soft, surprised laugh. "I guess I am." Liam watched the scene unfold, a silent observer in his own life. The air in the workshop was thick with the scent of pine and the unspoken tension of two worlds colliding. This was no longer about a forgotten lunch or a shared moment of vulnerability. This was something else. This was a choice, and Liam had no idea what the right one was. Catherine knelt, bringing herself down to Maya's level. The gesture was natural, unforced, and it softened something in Liam's defensive posture. "I heard it was a very important person's birthday today," Catherine said, her voice gentle. She held out the gift. "This is for you, if it's okay with your dad." All eyes turned to Liam. Maya looked at him, her expression a perfect blend of hope and deference. Catherine looked at him, her gaze a silent plea, an offering of truce. He felt trapped, caught between his pride and his daughter's hopeful face. He should say no. It was the sensible thing to do. Accepting a gift from a billionaire, no matter how well-intentioned, was a slippery slope, one he wasn't sure he could navigate. But then, he looked at the hand-carved bird clutched in Maya's other hand, his gift, a gift of love and effort. And he looked at the perfectly wrapped box in Catherine's hand, her gift. A gift of what? Atonement? Connection? A desperate attempt to feel something real? He realized, in that moment, that they weren't in competition. They were just two people trying in their own clumsy ways to make his daughter's day special. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "It's okay," he said, the words feeling both like a surrender and a victory. Maya's face broke into a radiant smile. She took the gift from Catherine, her small thank you a happy whisper. She sat down right there on the dusty floor and carefully began to peel away the paper. Liam leaned back against the workbench, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent guardian watching the scene unfold. The gift inside was a beautiful, hand-crafted music box, its wooden surface inlaid with a delicate floral pattern. When Maya lifted the lid, a tiny ballerina began to spin to the soft, tinkling melody of a song he didn't recognize. Maya was mesmerized, her eyes wide with wonder. It was an expensive gift, a thoughtful gift, a gift that screamed of a world he couldn't provide. And yet, watching his daughter's pure, unadulterated joy, he couldn't find it in himself to be resentful. "It's from a small shop in the village," Catherine said, as if sensing his thoughts. "I remembered she liked music." Liam just nodded, his throat tight. After a few minutes, Catherine stood up, brushing the sawdust from her jeans. "I should go," she said, not wanting to overstay her welcome. "Thank you," Liam said. And this time, he meant for more than just the gift. For coming. "Happy birthday, Maya," Catherine said, giving the little girl a soft smile before turning to leave. "Wait!" Maya called out, scrambling to her feet. She ran over to her little coloring station and grabbed the crumpled drawing of the bluebird she had been working on. She ran back and held it out to Catherine. "This is for you, so you don't be lonely." The breath caught in Catherine's throat. She took the drawing with a hand that trembled slightly. She looked at the smudged crayon, the lopsided wings, the earnest, heartfelt offering from a child who had everything and nothing to give. A single tear escaped and traced a silent path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but Liam saw it. He saw the crack in the perfect, composed facade. "Thank you," Catherine whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into her pocket as if it were a priceless treasure. And as she walked out of the workshop and back into the bright, indifferent sunlight, Liam knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something he was not prepared for. The following week was a study in quiet intrusion, a series of carefully orchestrated accidents and coincidences that Liam was too smart to believe and too intrigued to refuse. Catherine, it seemed, had a sudden and inexplicable interest in bespoke carpentry. It started with a phone call. A friend of hers needed a custom bookshelf built for a home office. The pay was surprisingly generous, the deadline flexible. Liam, who hadn't had a major commission in months, couldn't afford to say no. When he arrived at the address, a sleek, minimalist apartment overlooking the river, he found Catherine there, offering him a cup of coffee and explaining that her friend had been called away on an emergency. She stayed while he took measurements, her presence, a quiet, watchful energy in the large, empty room. She asked him about the wood, about the joinery, about the process. Her questions intelligent and genuinely curious. She didn't treat him like a laborer, she treated him like an artist. He found himself talking more than he usually did, explaining the nuances of grain and stain, the satisfaction of a perfect dovetail joint. She listened, her full attention on him, and he felt a forgotten flicker of pride in his craft, a pride that had been dulled by years of handyman repairs and budget-conscious clients. A few days later, she showed up at the workshop again, this time with 2 cups of coffee and a box of donuts. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, a phrase that was quickly becoming her signature excuse. Maya, who was now accustomed to the picnic lady's appearances, greeted her with a hug and immediately laid claim to the biggest donut. Catherine lingered, watching him work, her presence less of an interruption and more of a quiet hum in the background. She didn't fill the silence with idle chatter. She seemed to understand that his work required focus, that the workshop was his sanctuary. Instead, she sat with Maya, helping her with a drawing or reading to her from a book she'd brought. Liam would glance over from his workbench, the rhythmic scrape of his plane, the only sound, and see the 2 of them, their heads bent together in quiet concentration. He saw the way Catherine's face softened when she was with Maya, the way the hard, guarded lines around her eyes disappeared, replaced by a genuine warmth. He was building her a bookshelf, but she, in her own subtle, patient way, was dismantling his walls. He was still wary, still conscious of the vast, invisible gulf between their lives. He knew she was hiding something, that the story of her daughter was more complicated than she had let on. He knew that a woman like her didn't just happen to be in his neighborhood. But he was also starting to realize that he didn't want her to leave. Her presence had become a small, bright spot in his gray, predictable world. She brought with her a sense of possibility, a hint of a life beyond the daily grind of survival. And he was beginning to crave it. A dangerous, addictive feeling for a man who had taught himself to want for nothing. One rainy Saturday, the workshop was cold and damp, the sound of water drumming on the tin roof, a constant, mournful rhythm. Liam was struggling with a particularly stubborn piece of reclaimed oak, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt to smooth its warped surface. Maya was unusually quiet, sitting huddled in a blanket in the small office, watching a movie on his cracked phone screen. The power had flickered twice, and the workshop's ancient heater had finally given up the ghost an hour ago. The day felt bleak, a perfect reflection of his own flagging spirits. Just as he was about to give up and call it a day, Catherine appeared in the doorway, an umbrella dripping onto the concrete floor. She was holding a large, insulated bag. "I brought lunch," she announced, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for a billionaire to deliver takeout to a rundown workshop in the rain. Before he could protest, she was already setting up a small, impromptu picnic on a cleared workbench. She pulled out a thermos of hot tomato soup, grilled cheese sandwiches, wrapped in foil, and a container of freshly baked cookies. The smell filled the cold, damp air, a warm, comforting aroma that was a stark contrast to the day's gloom. "You didn't have to do that," Liam said, his voice gruff, but the protest was half-hearted. "I know," she said, handing him a steaming mug of soup, "but I wanted to." They ate in a comfortable silence, the sound of the rain, a gentle backdrop to the quiet clinking of their spoons. Maya, drawn out by the smell of grilled cheese, joined them, her earlier moodiness forgotten. Catherine didn't ask about his struggles, didn't comment on the cold or the leaky roof. She just shared a meal with them, a simple act of communion that felt more intimate than any conversation. After they finished, as Catherine was packing up, she paused, her gaze landing on the warped piece of oak. "What's the story with that one?" she asked. "It's a stubborn one," Liam admitted, a sigh of frustration escaping him. "It's beautiful wood, but it's twisted. I'm not sure it's salvageable." Catherine walked over and ran her hand over the rough, uneven surface. "Maybe it just needs a different approach," she said softly. "Sometimes The things that are the most warped are the ones that end up being the most beautiful, once you figure out how to work with them. You just have to be patient. She was talking about the wood, but Liam knew she was also talking about him. She saw his flaws, his struggles, his stubborn pride, and she wasn't running away. She was offering a different perspective. She was offering patience. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the money, past the mystery, past the walls she kept so carefully in place. He saw a woman who understood the beauty in imperfection, a woman who knew what it was like to be broken and still have value. And in the cold, dim light of the rainy workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and tomato soup, Liam felt a wall inside himself, a wall he hadn't even realized was there, begin to crumble. The bookshelf was finished. It stood in the corner of Liam's workshop, a testament to a week of focused, intense work. It was a beautiful piece, crafted from rich, dark walnut, its lines clean and modern, its joints seamless. Liam ran his hand over the smooth, polished surface, a deep sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. It was the best work he had done in years, and he knew, with a certainty that was both gratifying and unsettling, that it was because of her. Catherine's quiet presence had been a catalyst, a silent challenge that had pushed him to be better, to create something worthy of the space it would inhabit. He called her to let her know it was ready for delivery. He expected her to send a moving crew, to handle the transaction with the cool, impersonal efficiency he was sure she applied to the rest of her life. Instead, she said, "I'll be there in an hour. I want to see it." When she arrived, she didn't just glance at it. She walked around it, her fingers tracing the lines, her eyes taking in every detail. She noted the subtle curve of the shelves, the way the grain of the wood seemed to flow from one piece to the next. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she said, her voice filled with genuine awe. "You're a true artist, Liam." The compliment landed with a surprising weight, warming him in a way no paycheck ever could. "It's just a bookshelf," he said, deflecting with his usual gruff modesty. "No," she said, turning to face him. "It's a piece of you. It's solid and honest, and it's built to last." The intensity in her gaze made him uncomfortable, and he quickly changed the subject. "So, where is this friend of yours? I'll need help getting it into the truck." Catherine's smile was a mixture of guilt and amusement. "About that?" she said, her voice dropping slightly. "There is no friend." Liam stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with a sudden jarring clarity. The vague details, the flexible deadline, the generous pay, it had all been a lie. A kind lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. "The bookshelf is for me," she admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I'm renovating a new office, and I wanted something real in it. Something with a story." Anger, hot and sharp, flared in Liam's chest. He felt like a fool, a pawn in some rich woman's game. "So this was all just a setup?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "A way to give me a job without making it look like charity?" "No," she said, stepping closer. "It wasn't like that. I needed a bookshelf. I wanted you to build it. I didn't know how to ask. I was afraid you'd say no if you knew it was for me." "Why?" he demanded. "Because you thought I couldn't handle the fact that you're rich? Or because you didn't want your billionaire friends knowing you hired a no-name carpenter from the wrong side of town?" The words were harsh, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop them. The chasm between their worlds, the one he had been trying so hard to ignore, had just opened up at his feet, and he felt like he was falling. "It has nothing to do with that," she said, her voice pleading. "It has to do with me. I'm not good at this, Liam. I'm not good at letting people in. I don't know how to be normal. I saw a way to be near you, to be near Maya, and I took it. It was selfish, and it was clumsy, but it wasn't pity." She looked so vulnerable in that moment, so stripped of her usual composure, that Liam's anger began to falter, replaced by a confusing mix of frustration and a deep, unwilling sympathy. He looked at the bookshelf, the solid, honest thing he had built. and he looked at the woman who had commissioned it under false pretenses, a woman who was just as flawed and complicated as the warped piece of oak she had encouraged him to save. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to feel. He just knew that this was the moment of truth, the moment where he had to decide whether to walk away from this beautiful, infuriating, impossible woman, or to take a leap of faith and trust that her intentions, however misguided, were true. The silence in the workshop was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and fragile defenses. Liam turned away from Catherine, running a hand over his face, trying to process the revelation. He felt a fool's anger, the hot sting of being manipulated, even if the manipulation had been gentle. He had allowed himself to believe in a simple connection, a budding friendship, and now it all felt tainted by the secret she had kept. He had been a project, a carefully managed task in her otherwise orderly life. He paced the length of the workshop, the scuff of his boots on the concrete, the only sound. He needed to put distance between them, to think. "You should have just been honest," he finally said, his back still to her. "Honesty is something I'm out of practice with." Catherine's voice was quiet, laced with a shame that felt genuine. "In my world, honesty is a liability. It's a weakness your competitors can exploit. You learn to build walls, to control the narrative, to never let anyone see what you're really thinking. It's a hard habit to break." "I'm not one of your competitors, Catherine," he said, turning to face her, his eyes blazing. "I'm a carpenter. I fix things. I don't play games." "This wasn't a game," she insisted, her own frustration beginning to show. "This was me, trying, in the only way I knew how, to be a part of your life. A life that felt more real than my own. Was it the right way? No. But it was the only way I could think of that wouldn't scare you off. So, you lied instead," he said, the words a stark, simple condemnation. "I didn't lie," she countered, her voice rising. "I omitted. There's a difference." "Not to me," he shot back. "To me, it's the same thing. It's a lack of trust. And I don't have time for people I can't trust." Maya, who had been listening from the office doorway, her eyes wide, chose that moment to intervene. "Are you fighting?" she asked, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Both adults froze, their anger dissipating in the face of her innocent concern. Liam's shoulders slumped. He walked over and scooped her up, holding her tight against his chest. "No, sweet pea," he said, his voice soft now. "We're not fighting, we're just talking." Catherine watched them, her heart aching. She had done this. She had brought her own brand of complicated, messy deceit into their simple, honest world. She had broken the one thing she had been so desperate to protect, his trust. "I'm sorry, Liam," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I messed up. I know that." Liam looked at her over Maya's head, his expression unreadable. He didn't accept her apology, but he didn't reject it either. He just stood there, holding his daughter, a silent, unbreachable fortress of two. "I think you should go," he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The words were a punch to the gut, but Catherine knew she deserved them. She gave a small, defeated nod, turned, and walked out of the workshop, the silence she left behind a deafening roar. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she felt the familiar chill of loneliness wrap around her. She had found something real, and in her clumsy, fearful attempt to hold on to it, she had shattered it into 1,000 pieces. The days that followed were a return to the quiet, monotonous rhythm of Liam's old life, but the silence was different now. It was heavier, emptier. It was a silence that was defined by an absence. He threw himself into his work, taking on any job he could find, no matter how small or menial. He fixed broken fences, hung crooked doors, and patched holes in drywall, the physical labor, a welcome distraction from the turmoil in his own head. But at night, when the work was done and Maya was asleep, the thoughts would come rushing back. He would sit in the dark, the image of Catherine's face, etched with hurt and regret, replaying in his mind. He told himself he had done the right thing. He had protected his pride, his dignity, His small, carefully constructed world. He had refused to be a project, a pet charity for a lonely billionaire. But if he had done the right thing, why did it feel so wrong? Why did the workshop feel so empty? Why did he keep glancing at the door, half expecting her to appear with a box of donuts and a guilty smile? Maya felt the shift too. She was quieter, more subdued. She didn't ask about the picnic lady directly, but her drawings were full of them. Stick figures of a man, a little girl, and a woman with long flowing hair, always standing slightly apart, a visible gap between them. One evening, as he was tucking her into bed, she looked up at him with her wide, serious eyes. "Are you sad, Daddy?" The question was so direct, so perceptive, it caught him off guard. "No, sweet pea," he lied, stroking her hair. "I'm just tired." "You're sad because Catherine's not coming back, aren't you?" She pressed, her voice a soft, knowing whisper. Liam's throat tightened. He couldn't lie to her. Not about this. He sank onto the edge of her bed and let out a long, slow breath. "Yeah, kiddo," he admitted, his voice rough. "I guess I am." "Why did you make her go away?" she asked, her brow furrowed with confusion. "It's complicated," he said, the standard, useless adult answer. "She wasn't honest with us." "But she brought you soup when you were sad," Maya reasoned with the simple, profound logic of a child. "And she helped me with my drawing. And she made you laugh. Sometimes people make mistakes, Daddy. Mommy used to say that's how you know they're real." The words, so simple and so wise, were a dagger to his heart. He had been so focused on the lie, on the perceived slight to his pride, that he had completely missed the bigger picture. He had pushed away the one person who had seen him, really seen him, in years. The one person who had looked at his broken, messy life and seen something beautiful. He had been so afraid of being a project that he had failed to see that he was also a partner. He kissed Maya's forehead, his heart a tangled mess of regret and a new, dawning clarity. "You're right, sweet pea," he whispered. "You're so right." He walked back into the living room, a man undone by the wisdom of a 7-year-old. He had to fix this. He just didn't know how. Catherine's new office was the epitome of minimalist luxury. It was a cavernous space on the 50th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city she owned. The furniture was sleek, modern, and brutally expensive. The art on the walls was abstract and emotionally sterile, and in the center of it all, against the far wall, stood the bookshelf. It was the only thing in the room that had any warmth, any soul. It was the only thing that was real. She spent her days in that office, a ghost in her own life. She went through the motions, taking calls, attending virtual meetings, signing documents with a hand that felt disconnected from her body. She was back in her world, the world of power and control, but it felt more like a prison than ever before. Her assistant, a sharp, efficient young woman named Clara, watched her with a growing concern. "Are you all right, Miss Thorne?" she asked one afternoon, her voice carefully neutral. "You seem distant." "I'm fine, Clara," Catherine said, her gaze fixed on the bookshelf. "Just a lot on my mind." Clara followed her gaze. "It's a beautiful piece," she said. "The craftsmanship is incredible." "It is," Catherine agreed, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "It was made by a man who understands the value of honesty." That evening, after Clara had left, Catherine found herself standing in front of the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the smooth, dark wood. She could almost feel him, his presence embedded in the grain, in the perfect, seamless joints. She had driven him away with her fear, with her clumsy, misguided attempts at connection. She had wanted something real, and when she found it, she had treated it with the same transactional logic she applied to her business deals. She had been a fool. She pulled the crumpled bluebird drawing from her desk drawer, the one Maya had given her. "So you don't be lonely." The childish words were a constant, aching reminder of what she had lost. She smoothed out the paper, her heart heavy with a regret that was so profound it felt like a physical weight. She had to do something. She couldn't fix what she had broken with a simple apology. Words weren't enough. She needed a gesture, something that spoke louder than her clumsy apologies, something that proved she had learned her lesson. An idea began to form in her mind, a wild, audacious, and possibly foolish idea. It was a massive risk, one that could backfire spectacularly. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of her old, decisive self-return. She wasn't going to fix this with money. She was going to fix it with honesty. A loud, public, and terrifying honesty. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. The room was packed, a sea of journalists, photographers, and industry analysts, all buzzing with anticipation. Catherine Thorne had been a ghost for months, and her sudden, unannounced return to the public eye had sent shockwaves through the financial world. They were expecting an announcement about a new acquisition, a corporate restructuring, a denial of the rumors that had been swirling about her absence. They were not expecting what they got. Catherine walked to the podium, not in one of her signature power suits, but in a simple, elegant black dress. She looked calm, composed, but there was a new light in her eyes, a steady, unflinching clarity. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and strong, resonating through the silent room. "I know there has been a great deal of speculation about my whereabouts for the past few months. The truth is, I was taking some time to reevaluate. Not the company's portfolio, but my own." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the script they had been expecting. "For years," she continued, "I have operated under the assumption that success is measured in profit margins, in market share, in the cold, hard numbers that appear on a quarterly report. I have built a reputation for being ruthless, for being decisive, for being a woman who always gets what she wants. And in the process, I lost sight of what is truly valuable." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "I recently met a man, a carpenter. He's an artist, a man who builds beautiful, honest things with his hands. He's also a single father who, by the world's standards, has very little. But he is the richest man I have ever known, because he has integrity. He has a fierce, unwavering pride in his work. And he has a love for his daughter that is so profound, so absolute, it could power this entire city." The journalists were scribbling furiously, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "This man," she said, her voice softening, "reminded me of a truth I had long forgotten. That our real value is not in what we own, but in what we build. Not just with steel and glass, but with kindness, with empathy, with honesty." She took a deep breath. "Effective immediately, the Thorne Foundation will be shifting its focus. We are launching a new initiative, the Builders Fund, dedicated to providing grants and resources to independent artisans, craftspeople, and small, family-owned businesses. The people who are the true backbone of our communities. The people we have overlooked for too long." She looked directly into the camera, as if she were speaking to an audience of one. "I made a mistake. I broke the trust of a good man because I was afraid. I hid behind my money because I had forgotten how to be a person. And this is my apology. Not just to him, but to myself. It's time to start building things that matter again." And with that, she stepped away from the podium, leaving behind a room full of stunned reporters, and a message that was far more valuable than any stock report. It was a message of hope, of redemption, and of the transformative power of a simple, honest truth. Liam was in the workshop, sanding a tabletop, the rhythmic motion a familiar comfort, when his phone buzzed with a text from a friend. "Dude, you need to see this." A link was attached. He clicked on it, his brow furrowed, and watched the press conference on his cracked screen. He watched as Catherine, the woman he had pushed away, stood in front of the world and laid her soul bare. He heard her talk about him, about his work, about his love for Maya, and he felt a wave of emotions so powerful it almost knocked him off his feet. It was a mixture of shock, of pride, of a deep, soul-shaking humility. She hadn't just apologized. She had changed her entire world. She had taken his quiet, private values and turned them into her new, public mission. She had seen him, all of him, and instead of being ashamed of his simple, struggling life, she had held it up to the world as something to be admired. He sank onto a nearby stool, the phone trembling in his hand. The anger, the pride, the fear that had kept him walled off for so long, it all just dissolved. It was replaced by a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. He had to go to her. He didn't know what he would say, what he would do. He just knew that he had to be there. He grabbed his keys, his heart pounding a frantic, joyful rhythm against his ribs. He was a man who fixed things. And he had just realized that the most important thing he had ever broken was his own stubborn, fearful heart. And it was time to put it back together. He found her not in her gleaming office tower, but back at the park, sitting on their bench. She was alone, staring out at the water, her hands tucked into the pockets of a simple wool coat. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of surprise and a deep, weary vulnerability. "You saw," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. He nodded, his throat too tight for words. He sat down beside her, leaving a small, respectful space between them. For a long time, they just sat in silence, watching the day die. "It was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. She let out a soft, shaky breath. "I don't know about brave," she said. "It felt more like necessary." "The Builders Fund," he said, a small, incredulous smile touching his lips. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, turning to face him, her eyes searching his. "But I wanted to. I wanted to build something that you would be proud of." He looked at her, at this incredible, impossible woman who had turned her life upside down, all because of a conversation on a park bench. The last of his walls came crashing down. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his, a perfect, trusting fit. "I was a fool," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper. "I was so afraid of being hurt, of you leaving, that I pushed you away. I'm sorry." "I was a fool too," she said, her voice choked with tears. "I was so afraid of not being enough, of you seeing the real me, that I wasn't honest. I'm sorry." The apologies hung in the air, a final, cleansing rain. "So," he said, a slow, hopeful smile spreading across his face. "Where do we go from here?" Catherine looked at their joined hands, then back at his face, her own expression mirroring his hope. "I don't know," she said, "but I think, for the first time in a very long time, I'd like to build something with a partner." He squeezed her hand, a silent promise passing between them. The sun had disappeared, but the sky was still glowing, a beautiful, bruised purple. The city lights began to twinkle on, a million tiny stars in a man-made galaxy. And on a worn park bench, two lonely souls, a carpenter and a queen, finally found their way home. The first project, of the Builders Fund, was a community workshop, a large, airy space built on a neglected plot of land on the edge of Liam's neighborhood. It was a place where local artisans could rent affordable studio space, where kids could take after-school classes in woodworking and pottery, where the quiet, creative pulse of the community could have a home. Liam, of course, was its heart. He ran the place, not as a manager, but as a mentor, his gruff, patient wisdom, a guiding force for a new generation of builders. Catherine was its mind. She handled the logistics, the funding, the endless paperwork, her sharp, decisive mind, now focused on building communities instead of conglomerates. They were a team, a perfect, unlikely partnership. Their lives, once so separate, had merged into a beautiful, chaotic, and deeply fulfilling new reality. Catherine's penthouse was sold, replaced by a warm, comfortable house with a big backyard just a few blocks from the workshop. The sleek, modern furniture was gone, replaced by pieces that Liam had built with his own two hands, each one a testament to their shared story. Maya, of course, was their son, the bright, joyful center of their new universe. She thrived in the stable, loving environment they had created, her laughter a constant, happy melody in their home. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the press conference, the three of them were in the workshop, putting the finishing touches on a new sign for the entrance. Maya, now a confident 8-year-old, was carefully painting the letters, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Catherine was sanding the edges, her movements sure and practiced now. Liam was drilling the holes for the mounting bolts. "I think it's ready," Maya announced, stepping back to admire her work. The sign was simple, elegant, crafted from a single, beautiful piece of reclaimed oak. It read, "The Thorn, Morgan Workshop, built with heart." Catherine looked at Liam, her eyes shining. "What do you think?" He looked from the sign to his daughter, to the woman he loved, and a wave of gratitude so profound it was almost painful washed over him. "I think," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that it's the most beautiful thing we've ever built." He pulled her into his arms, the scent of sawdust and varnish and her familiar, wonderful perfume filling his senses. He kissed her, a deep, soulful kiss that was a promise, a celebration, a thank you. Maya giggled, covering her eyes with her hands, peeking through her fingers. "Ew, grown-up stuff," she said, but she was smiling. Later that evening, as they sat on their front porch, watching the stars come out, Catherine leaned her head on Liam's shoulder. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. "The old life? The power? The money?" She was silent for a moment, then she shook her head. "No," she said. "I have everything I ever wanted right here." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. They sat there for a long time, two people from two different worlds who had found a new world together. A world built not on what they had, but on who they were. A world built on a foundation of kindness, of honesty, and of a love that was as solid and as real as the beautiful, honest things they built with their hands. It was a love that was, finally, built to last. An epilogue of sorts, a final snapshot of their beautifully merged lives, came 5 years later. It was a sun-drenched Saturday, the kind of perfect late spring day that felt like a gift. The community workshop was buzzing with a joyful energy. It was the annual student showcase, and the space was filled with proud parents, curious neighbors, and the happy, chaotic chatter of children showing off their creations. Liam moved through the crowd with a quiet, easy confidence, a proud smile on his face as he stopped to admire a lopsided birdhouse or a brightly glazed pot. He was grayer at the temples now, the lines around his eyes deeper, but he looked 10 years younger than the tired, struggling man who had sat on that park bench all those years ago. Catherine was by the refreshment table, pouring lemonade into paper cups, laughing as she chatted with a group of mothers. She wore a simple sundress, and her hair was in a loose, carefree braid. There was no trace of the lonely, guarded CEO she had once been. She moved with a grace and warmth that was entirely her own, a woman who was finally, completely at home in her own skin. Maya, now a lanky, bright-eyed 12-year-old, was the event's unofficial tour guide. She moved through the workshop with her father's quiet confidence and her mother's easy charm, explaining the different projects to visitors, her voice filled with a deep, infectious pride. At one point, a local journalist, a young woman new to the town, approached Catherine, a notebook in her hand. "Miss Thorne," she began, her voice a little star-struck, "it's an incredible thing you've built here. Can I ask what inspired you to walk away from your old life to start something like this?" Catherine's smile was soft, her gaze drifting across the crowded room until it landed on Liam, who was helping a small boy fix a wobbly leg on a wooden robot. "It wasn't one thing," she said, her voice a low, happy murmur. "It was 1,000 small things, but it started with a sandwich." The journalist looked confused. "A sandwich?" Catherine just smiled, a secret, happy light in her eyes. "The best one I never had." Later, as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the workshop floor, the three of them stood together by the large bay doors, watching the last of the visitors leave. Liam wrapped his arms around Catherine and Maya, pulling them into a tight hug. "Good day," he said, his voice a contented rumble. "The best," Maya agreed, leaning her head against his chest. Catherine looked up at him, her love for him a tangible, living thing in her eyes. "You know," she said, her voice a soft, playful whisper, "I still have that drawing." "The one of the bluebird." Liam smiled. "I still have the music box." Maya looked up at them, a mischievous grin on her face. "And I," she announced, "have the story. And it's the best one of all." And she was right. It was a story of two worlds colliding, of two lonely souls finding each other, of a family built not by blood but by choice. It was a story that had started with a quiet, desperate sacrifice on a cold park bench and had ended in a world of warmth and light, and a love that was as solid and as beautiful as the things they built together. It was a story that was, in the end, about the quiet, extraordinary power of building a life with a good and honest heart.